Good afternoon, and welcome to the November 2020 program of Live with Kelly and Ken. I'm Ken Randall, and my co-host is Kelly Testi, who is the president and CEO of LSAC, and like me, a former law school dean. Almost monthly, we bring together a panel of great experts to discuss a matter of interest and significance, particularly to those interested in law schools, the legal profession, and to legal education. Kelly, I think this is probably the third time in 2 years that we focused on the subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And today is a really good time for us to return to it, particularly after the November elections, particularly after the summer that we've had with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're delighted to have the expertise of four panelists who have not been with us before. And I want to just tell our panelists how grateful we are that you've joined us. You have so many demands on your time, and I want to introduce you, and then I'll turn it over to Kelly for some good Q&A. I'm going to go in alphabetical order. First, from the Howard University Law School, Dean Danielle Holly Walker. Dean Holly Walker previously was the academic dean and a professor at the University of South Carolina, and her teaching and scholarly interests include inequality and education. Secondly, we have Professor Beverly Moran, the Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine, and also a former dean, the former dean of UCLA from 2010 to 2015. And Dean Moran's subjects also include inequality in educational policymaking and Latino-related law and policy. Dean, we're glad to have you with us as well. And then our third dean, and coming back to the Washington, D.C., Virginia area, we have Dean Ben Spencer, who also serves as the Chancellor Professor of Law at the William and Mary Law School. He previously has held leadership positions and taught at UVA and at Washington and Lee. And then finally, from the legal profession, one of the real leaders in this area of diversity and inclusion, Mr. Joe West, who's a partner in Duane Morris in Washington, D.C. He serves as the firm's Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer. He's a partner in the firm's trial practice group and also chairs the firm's diversity and inclusion consulting practice. Panelists, thank you for spending your time with us. The way we're going to organize ourselves is that Kelly will ask you some questions. I'll be keeping up with some questions from the audience, and about halfway through, I'll ask some questions from our audience. But Kelly, good to be with you as always.
Thank you so much, Ken. And it's really nice to be with you today, Ken. And I want to thank our panelists as well. It's so good to see each and every one of you. I want to welcome our audience, whether you're a law school candidate, someone who works in legal education and in the field of diversity, equity, inclusion. We're really glad you've joined us today for this important conversation. And what I think I'll do to get us started is I'll ask each of our panelists to begin with some opening remarks, because goodness, we've been through quite a time in the United States and around the world with the pandemic, the economic crisis, a renewed reckoning with racial justice that I know I'm certainly happy to see and eager to see where that goes, and just so much swirling with elections and more. So let me get started, and I think what I'll do is start with Professor Rachel Moran and then move around the panelists to really just get an opening comment on, what's on your mind right now, as you think of all that we're facing. When you think about equity and law and education, what are you thinking about today? So Rachel, welcome, and first to you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And for me, what I think is top of mind in higher education are two things. One is the ongoing issues of access and affordability in higher education. And I do think that our incoming administration, the Biden administration, has made it a priority to move away from this model of privatization where people self-finance their educations, and is really trying to find ways to make education more affordable. The focus is on college, but ultimately that helps law students, because if their undergraduate career is more affordable, they then find law school more attainable. The second thing is diversity, where the Trump administration has taken a pretty adversarial stance towards the consideration of race in college and university admissions. the Biden administration has said that it will reinstate what the Obama administration had done in that area. That, of course, leaves the Supreme Court an open question on the issue of diversity, because there are Harvard cases just been decided at the appellate level and might go up to the Supreme Court. Finally, the issue of leadership would be the third and final one. Here, I think it's not a policy platform. It is, I think, a reckoning with the problems of leadership and civic identity that were revealed in this election. And I think law schools could have an important role to play in kind of knitting together, again, the fabric that's essential to our democracy.
Thank you so much. Mr. West, let me move to you for your comments on that, that question. What are you seeing from where you're sitting now?
Kelly, thank you for that. And thank you for having invited me to participate. I'm actually going to start by acknowledging a question that we already have. And I think it'll dovetail nicely with the comments that I wanted to make, particularly from the perspective that I bring to this panel, having worked almost evenly over the course of my career in large corporations. I was at Walmart for 5 years. Part of that time, I was in charge of the outside counsel management function, where I interfaced a lot with the large roster of outside firms that Walmart utilized. I spent some time as the CEO of the Minority Corporate Counsel Association as well. And what I see now is that there is a greater demand for lack of a better term, fluency in the corporate legal sector around issues of diversity and inclusion. I think that's being driven by a couple of things. First of all, just the weight of demographic inevitability in this country, but also I think finally an acknowledgement, an understanding, and appreciation, a recognition for the business case for diversity and inclusion. That was the case even before George Floyd was murdered, and there was this sort of new awakening and understanding and appreciation around these issues. The question that someone has posed is what advice and guidance you have for applicants who've been working in diversity, equity, and inclusion and want to focus on this as lawyers. I think right now, in this time period, there is probably the best opportunity for you to do that because of the reasons I just mentioned. I think so many organizations, law firms, corporations are starting to have a greater appreciation and understanding for how and why these issues are important. And so those opportunities, which we can talk about later, are there in a way that they previously had not existed.
Well, that's great to hear. And thank you so much for all the leadership you've provided over the years on that front. We're all grateful for that. Dean Spencer, let me get you into this conversation. I want to welcome you to the Dean ranks. We are all delighted with your appointment. And so let me ask you to share some opening reflections.
One of the things that has come to the top of my mind in the wake of the election has been the role of the lawyers in this post-election denialism that's taking place, and seeing how members of the legal profession are questioning the legitimacy of the results of the election, and what does that mean for how we should train our students in terms of their ethics and professional responsibilities. I think we're going to have to do more as we transmit professional responsibility to our students, to highlight to them the responsibility that we have as members of the bar and the legal profession, to really be careful with our words and our authority. When I hear a lot of lawyers out there saying just blatantly unsupportable and unsubstantiated things, I want our students to know that this is not acceptable. And I think we're going to have to really pay some attention to that as we continue, it seems, in this post-fact era. We're going to have to make sure that the lawyers that we're producing are not going out and becoming part of that or perpetuating that, but being some people that can push back against that. So that's one of the main things. And another thing that I've noticed, which I know you have noticed as well, is there's been a dramatic increase in applications to law schools. And this was, of course, before the election, and I'm wondering what the impacts would be on the applicant pool after the election, but clearly there's a thirst among people to pursue legal education as their means of responding to this moment, whether it's from the events from this summer or after the election and a desire to get involved. Related to that, I'm thinking about that as many of these people are motivated to move into law school, I would imagine a lot of them are interested in public policy and shaping public policy. So it's causing me to think about, well, do we need to modify our curriculum in some way that provides more opportunities for these students to learn about public policy and to be educated in that way? So those are some more mundane considerations, but as a dean, it's things that I'm thinking about. I want to make sure that we're positioned to receive those students and educate them in a way that's going to meet the needs and the aspirations that they have.
Thank you, Dean Spencer, and it's wonderful to understand this great interest in law, and we'll talk in a little bit about why that might be and what we can do to help support students. I want to remind all of you who might be out there and our candidates, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A today. LSAC has a group that is helping answer those, and we'll be bringing those in to the conversation a little later too. Dean Holly Walker, I want to turn to you for your opening comments. You're in such a vital role as the Dean of Howard's Law School at this critical time in our history, so I'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I just want to thank you and Ken for doing this. And it's wonderful to see so many attendees in the audience today, and just great to be here with my colleagues and with Professor Moran, who I've always admired so much in terms of her research and scholarship, inspired me as a young scholar. And so I'm especially thrilled to be on the call with her, and Dean Spencer, who I went to law school with. And so we've known each other for years, and obviously Joe West. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. I think particularly in my position as Dean at Howard's Law School, Howard's mission is to educate the next generation of lawyer leaders to lead the fight for racial justice. And so we are a mission law school, and the mission that we have really carried on for the last 151 years is one that is right at the forefront of everything that's happening today. So echoing what Joe West said, is that we have had more interest than ever in what we do. And I think particularly our students are interested in, how do we train them in law school? And this is just what Dean Spencer was saying, to become lawyers who are prepared to do racial justice work, right? So what is the curriculum that we need? What are the centers that we need? What are the clinics that we need to really be able to prepare them? And I think one thing I've become even more interested in is, how do we take our mission at Howard, train our students to do racial justice work, and then have them partner with law students all over the country to also provide them with that training, so that we don't make our mission solely insular and only related to Howard, but that this is something, a project that we can really work on with all of the law schools across the country, because students are reaching out to me from pretty much every corner of the United States you can think of to ask me what we are doing at Howard. And it's not just students, but professors and academic leadership. And so I want Howard to really be a convening place, a place where our philosophy around racial justice is one that we can be in partnership and collaboration. And I'm really seeing law schools want to further collaboration in this area. And along that same lines, I worked this summer with the AALS and other law deans to put together the AALS Anti-Racist Clearing Project. And I think one thing that we've seen from that project is it really helps law schools to examine ourselves internally, right? So it's hard to say that we do racial justice work in criminal justice reform, in education reform, in income inequality, climate change. It's hard to preach those messages and to teach our students to do that if we don't get our own houses in order. And so I think this question of how law schools themselves become anti-racist spaces is something that we as a field in legal education are really dealing with and working with. And lastly, I cannot help but to emphasize enough what Dean Spencer said about the project of democracy, right? We must be in the business as legal educators of promoting democracy in a nonpartisan way that says there are things that we must believe in if we believe in keeping this country's democracy healthy. We must combat voter suppression. We must combat conspiracy theories related to the safety of our elections. And so I think those are the critical things that we have to do right now, that we have an obligation to teach our law students to really be in the pro-democracy business.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your leadership. It's encouraging to hear of that outreach and more potential for collaboration. That's really good to know. Rachel, let me come back to you for a moment. Several of you have mentioned the unique place that law sits, that law and legal education might have to the role it has in advancing equity right now. Do you have comments on that angle of this conversation as well?
Well, first of all, I think law traditionally has played a tremendously important role, for good or ill. And, people out there in the audience undoubtedly have heard of the iconic decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, which really helped us to rethink the normative foundations of our discourse about race. And we're still having battles over what Brown meant or should have signaled to our society about race and inclusion. But I also think law has an important place in the creation of the bureaucracy, right, that entrenches these values, that gives them a place to be expressed. And so when you think about why Brown had any impact in the South, it was because of the enforcement bureaucracy that was created at the federal level to make change and to make more lasting change. Now, it's ironic because we've seen a lot of resegregation. Schools are more segregated now, for many groups than they were. Brown didn't actually do that, but people used to say Brown can't change the hearts and minds of, they said men, but we mean people. And it did. I think our racial attitudes have changed, although much of the segregation in the schools is still there. Finally, I want to say that I do think we need to rethink our approach to race and equity, because the tools of the civil rights movement were created at a moment when 1 out of 10 Americans identified as non-white and 90% were African American. That is not our demographic landscape today. About 40% have some kind of minority identification or racial or ethnic identification. Latinx are the largest group now, and we don't have a clearly dominant racial or ethnic group. And whites are not going to be a majority in the future. So we really need to rethink what racial equity means in a demographically transformed landscape.
Thank you so much. Let me ask Mr. West, any comments on the particular role of law at this time and in advancing race equity?
Well, I think that's a difficult question, but I think probably on its face an easy one, because there really hasn't been any major significant change in our society where lawyers and people with a meaningful approach to equity have not been sort of at the forefront of it. You started the conversation off, I think, talking about this year and talking about some of the things that have impacted all of us. One thing I want to sort of add to this equation is the pandemic itself. I think a lot of people will think back to the George Floyd incident as the moment when sort of the entire planet became focused on this issue. The thing that's curious about that is that George Floyd wasn't the first Black man to be unfortunately killed at the hands of the authorities. I think perhaps the way it happened was more grisly than we had probably seen in the sort of visceral way that we did. I would suggest to you that the pandemic had a lot to do with the reaction that most people have been having in quarters that previously you would not have seen around these issues. And I think that's because it sort of created, for lack of a better term, sort of a democratization of empathy that you didn't really have before. Having grown up, a man of a certain age, having grown up in the Deep South, I know what it's like to be fearful and to understand that perhaps you could lose your life just leaving your house to go to the grocery store. I would submit to you that most African Americans, particularly African American men, have felt that at some point in their lives. I think what the pandemic did is it made all of us realize what that might feel like. And that sort of background noise, that democratization of empathy around that was present when that incident happened, and it sort of reverberated around the world. And I believe has probably caused all of us in the legal profession to have an understanding of how important this might be. And I would just say to you that even if you don't purposely go into the profession seeking to go into a role where equity and justice is at the heart of what you do, there is still a place for you. I'm on the board of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. I heard, Dean Spencer and Dean Holly Walker talk about issues around justice and the democracy, the need for truth and understanding how democracy works. There are places for all of us to play a role, regardless of what our day jobs might happen to be. And I think that's something that we're starting to understand better and better.
Thank you so much. I appreciate those comments. And Dean Holly Walker, I saw when Mr. West was speaking about how the pandemic has created a particular opportunity perhaps right now. I saw you nodding along to that. Do you want to add some further comments on this score?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we saw this summer after the murder of George Floyd was this wanting to understand the law across discipline, right? I thought that was one of the interesting things that happened at Howard is and we've been becoming particularly interested in movement lawyering. So kind of partnering with communities who are in the midst of crisis and dealing with police violence, racial violence in their communities. And I think, so we did a couple of very big webinars. One of them was on the killing of Breonna Taylor and helping people in the Louisville community and other communities to understand the legal issues around it. And we were able to do that because of the pandemic. Normally that would be something that would happen inside of our building. And instead, there were over 1,000 people from all over the country who came to hear experts from Howard talk about the case of Breonna Taylor. And I think what I heard in that conversation was that people in their communities who are marching and who are out in the streets, many of them for the first time. And I think I saw in the Q&A people saying, I've never had any training in social justice issues. I've never had any training in doing racial justice work. And I think that lawyers have a particular opportunity to go into communities right now, and partly made a little bit easier by the fact that now there's this normalization of what we're doing right now, which is being together, across the country and really being able to train and help communities as they're engaging in this, meaningful work towards structural change. So one of the partnerships we've been doing is with MPD, with the Metropolitan Police Department, and we're doing it with police departments across the country on the consequences to communities from stop and frisk policies. And this is a collaboration between Howard, Georgetown Law, and police departments across the country. And so I think we need to seize some of the opportunities that we have that are coming from the pandemic to allow us to really broaden our ability to engage in these important discussions.
That's a wonderful initiative, Dean Holly Walker. And I note that earlier you mentioned the wonderful clearinghouse, the ALS clearinghouse on race equity. That's such a good resource. And I know that many law schools are also working with the ABA on a project together around policing. So there is a lot happening in the law schools, and not just individually, but together. That's good to see. And students will enjoy that as they get into those programs. Dean Spencer, I want to come back to you. You had mentioned in your opening comments just that there are more people applying to law school and a strong interest in public policy that you're seeing as well. Just curious on your general reflections about, why is this a good time to pursue law, and any advice you might have for candidates that are embarking on that enrollment journey?
Well, when you have a lot of social unrest as you've had of late, and you combine that with what's going on with the election and potential threats to democracy and the rule of law, which is amazing in this country. There's, it's a time like this when you really need people who are learned in the law and committed to trying to move things in the right direction. And that's why, as we've responded to this increased interest in studying the law, I've decided that one way that our law school can be part of the solution is trying to increase accessibility and participate in helping to diversify the legal profession, so that we are training people who are going to go out and be committed to this cause. So one of the important things that I think we should do as law schools is try to redistribute some of the aid that has traditionally been labeled as merit-based aid, and move some of that aid, which is what I've committed to do, towards opening up to people who are expressly committed to pursuing equal justice as a part of what they want to do with their career. So I've set aside some what I've called equal justice scholarships, and some scholarships for people who have gone to traditionally Black universities and colleges, some need-based scholarships, and some pipeline programs that really reach back and open up opportunities for those who might be first generation or from traditionally underrepresented groups. I think that's a really important thing that we can do. And I think another thing that we can do is, once the students are here, is to make sure that there are opportunities for them to practice what they have been preaching, which is to try to work in clinics that are associated with racial and social justice. And so we've just started a new racial and social justice center here at our law school. And that's going to provide students with opportunities to do research and work in that area. And we're also starting a community law clinic that's going to allow our students to go out into the community and do things along these lines. So I think there's a lot of ways that law schools can really engage with the students, help to bring them in, diversify the profession, and give them good experiences while they're here working on social justice issues.
Hey, Kelly,
That's great.
can I say something about that?
Please go ahead.
Well, I heard Danielle earlier mention that she's a member of the Dean Moran fan club, as am I. And one of the reasons I became so is because I had the privilege of serving with her on the ABA's task force on the financing of legal education. And I'm listening to Dean Spencer talk, and some of the recommendations that came from that task force, and that was in 2014, were to demonstrate the types of flexibility and creativity around resources that he just described. So I would encourage people to take a look at that report, and you will see, I'm sure that this is just the brilliance of Dean Spencer, probably having not read the report, but being prescient enough and to understand the kinds of creativity that was recommended and suggested in the report. But kudos to you, Dean Spencer, for doing exactly that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And I have to confess, I want to claim being the chair of the Rachel Moran fan club, but I think, those ideas about financing are so critical. It relates very much to one of the things the Law School Admission Council feels so strongly about, is that our origins were to enhance access and equity. And we urge all the time for schools to make sure they're employing a holistic admission process. Research shows that using the LSAT as one factor really enhances equity, but we want to make sure that we're looking at all factors, and our schools are trying very hard to do that. So I want to make sure candidates know that you are seen as you, and they want to know you and who you are. I want to get Rachel and Danielle in on this too, because this question of just from pre-law all the way through practice, how do we support that pipeline, or is there, fix that pipeline? So let me go first to Dean Moran and then over to Dean Holly Walker for some further thoughts on supporting students on those journeys.
Well, I want to first of all echo the importance of the pipeline programs already mentioned, because they really give students not just the opportunity to understand how to get to law school, but also whether that's really what they want. And I think both of those things are important. I also think that the idea of accessibility and scholarship money is important. And scholarships don't just give you money. When you get a named scholarship, they give you status. And if you connect people to alumni through the scholarships, it gives you access to a social network. So those are all three important elements of a scholarship. But I also want to return to the issue of social capital, because I have been looking at the research and I keep seeing over and over that students who are from previously underrepresented groups, first generation, race, ethnicity, whatever that might be, find it difficult to access the social capital at their institutions. And that is a very significant barrier to full inclusion in both the educational process and the profession. So it's not just enough to be in the room, but you have to have access to all of that experience, all of the advice and the counseling. And I just have kept seeing this in study after study that people do not feel that they have access to that social capital. And I think that's a structural issue law schools need to address.
Absolutely. Dean Holly Walker, your follow-up on that.
Yes, I think we've seen, the research shows us that pipeline programs are important starting from middle school, right? So the first time we need to make meaningful intervention in terms of exposing students to the possibility that they could be lawyers, that they could engage in higher education and professional school education. And so I'm a strong believer in law schools having middle school pipeline programs. I started one at University of South Carolina where we worked with Title I schools that were right in the neighborhood of our law school. We brought them into the law school, gave them a moot court competition that in the finals was judged by a federal court judge, an African-American woman, so they could really see representation in the profession. And that many of our law students, so this was a program run by our law students, many of our law students came from the schools, the Title I schools that they were attending. And so that was a critical project. Currently, we have adopted a sister school. Howard has the Thurgood Marshall Academy in Southeast DC. And we work with those students to really encourage them to become interested in the legal profession. And then we started a pipeline program for HBCU undergrads. And this is a pipeline program where we try to open those networks for social capital. So we do it for PhDs, for health sciences, this is across the university, and for law students, so that they have a cohort, so that they understand that there is a group that can go into each one of these fields. And so pipeline programs are important, but I think one of the things that we've seen, there are so many pipeline programs that we are doing, again, without collaboration, which means that they're hard to sustain and it's hard to figure out over time what the impact is. So I would like to see the profession focus more and more on pipeline programs that are really done across institutions, so that none of us are claiming our individual pipeline programs, but instead to see these broader partnerships so that pipeline programs can be more sustainable and have broader impact.
Agreed. Certainly from where I sit, I think that's something that really needs to advance, and we're working on a couple of things there that I hope will help. We've also discovered we need to go earlier in the pipeline. It's not just at college, right, but earlier in high schools. And LSAC works hard with street law to work in all the law-themed high schools, but there's always more to do. I want to turn this to Ken, and as I do that, I see a number of candidates asking questions. Am I too old to go to law school? Are they really looking for a diversity of background? And the answer is that you're not too old. My oldest student graduated once at 82. He was a doctor. So please know that that law schools are serious when they say that they're really welcoming and seeking to be very inclusive. Ken, I want to turn it to you and also just remind, as I do that, all the candidates who are on, that you can obtain free LSAT preparation through the Khan Academy. It's an awesome resource and it's working great, as well as through LSAC and our Law Hub. We provide that as well. And anyone who needs a computer or they need a quiet place to test and taking the LSAT, we make sure you have that. So if you don't know where else to start and you're looking for some access, we're there to help you. So Ken, let me turn it to you. I know you have some questions for the panelists and we'll keep our conversation rolling.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. And Kelly, everyone knows that some of the reason for the increase in applications, I think, also has to do with the great job that LSAC has done and the LSAT Flex that you had this summer. You've made it much easier for students to take the LSAT, to prep for the LSAT. So everyone here I know is real appreciative of what you've done and what LSAC has done. So you give me a hard job because so far we have 71 questions. So you gave me the hard job this time, and I'm going to kind of throw a couple out there. It's hard to choose. Everyone's question and comment really will be responded to, but let's just start. And Dean Moran, I want to ask you a question. You talked about accessible and affordable education. I've spent the last 7 or 8 years working in the online space. A lot of students have sent in questions about the increase in hybrid education. You know, we know that at least until this year, the ABA only allowed 1/3 of credits online. So is online ed something here to stay for the future to make education more accessible?
Well, first of all, I want to say that I don't know exactly how we will look going forward, but I do think many students appreciate the opportunity to interact with their peers and their faculty and, you know, the staff and attorneys and so on a face-to-face basis. And I know there's been a lot of creativity, particularly with respect to clinics, to make sure they can still serve clients. But I do think, at least from my vantage point, all the students I hear from can't wait till they can go back and do it in person. And that's because a lot of the law school skills are not what you get transmitted in terms of knowledge, but there are other skills that involve a great deal of interpersonal action and judgment about people's qualities, right? When can a client hear you? When are you not going to be heard? So there's all these interpersonal skills that are incredibly important. And we also heard about the issue of values. And I think that values are kind of, there's a certain element of Zoom, right, that flattens people out literally on the screen. And so I don't know that you can have quite the same kind of exchange of ideas about values. And so while I think that we learned a lot, and I have to say, I learned a lot in a crash course on remote learning. And I think there are things we could continue to do, events that can attract many more people than one that's on site. But I do think there's a place for in-person. I think it's an important place in law. And if we've learned anything from this election, it is about also how technology can divide us, make us feel more depersonalized. And thus there's a polarization. And I think law school has to be a place where we can have hard conversations. And sometimes that's hard to do on Zoom.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Dean Spencer or Holly Walker, is online, at least for part-time students or non-traditional students, a way to reduce the tuition for students?
Well, I think online, I agree with Dean Moran that there are some things that are best done in person. But I think there are a lot of things that we've learned through this experience that should be retained that will actually help accessibility and opportunities. One of those things, for example, is we've been able to expand our reach with employers who don't necessarily spend the time to come when you have to travel physically to where we are. Now that we have virtual access to these employers, we're able to get our students who may have been traditionally overlooked in that process, we're able to connect directly with the employers and put those students in front of them. Another thing that's been really remarkable is we've wanted to get mentoring programs off the ground for our students who are going to be mentored by alumni. But you have alumni who are all over the country and very busy with their practices. And it's been difficult to make that happen in the past. But now with Zoom, it's been seamless. We're able to reach out to our alums and put them in touch with organizations like BALSA or the Latinx Students Association and make that direct connection that they can then follow up with. And then the last thing is, I think a good part of the virtual experience that can be retained is using that in-person time in the ways that Dean Moran discussed, and using the remote online time for things that you don't have to do in person. Like you could have, maybe a 20-minute lecture that outlines the material, and then you can spend time in class physically together, working through problems or discussing the tough issues and that sort of thing. So I'm hopeful that the ABA is going to provide some flexibility going forward to allow us to retain the best of what we've learned through this Zoom experience.
Great. Thank you, Dean. Dean Holly Walker, anything to add on how we might make?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that for us, I think there is a critical part of what we do that really needs to be done in person. And I think a lot of it is that kind of building of social capital that was talked about before, building of networking. We have, even though I think the delivery of course content, that portion of it has gone well, right? The delivery of course content. but there's so much more that happens in a law school than delivery of course content. And I think a lot of that is around issues of networking. How do we establish good, just interpersonal skills among lawyers in a professional way that sometimes it is flat on Zoom and encourages, I think, incivility sometimes in terms of the anonymous nature of commenting and asking questions, et cetera. And our students have told us very clearly that they are anxious to be back in person, right? And so I think that while they've seen some cost savings, because your question particularly was about savings in terms of the overall law school experience, they've experienced some savings because many of them didn't have to move to the very expensive DMV area, right? So they may be able to be at home and learning in an environment in which they don't have to pay for, the Washington, D.C. apartment. But I think what they're missing out on is that ability to be with their cohort in person and establish, I think, really good habits for lawyers that we all have to establish, which is, working long hours away from home. And maybe some of that in the world will change. But I think in terms of cost savings, our students, while they've appreciated it, have said very clearly that they want to return to an in-person experience as soon as possible.
Great, thank you. Now, with applications up, for deans, we think that's a great thing generally. But some applicants looking at the question and answer want to say, is this then a harder time for me to be applying to law school? So I'll stick with you, Dean Holly Walker. What advice would you give to students, particularly non-traditional students, in applying when applications are up and the competition may be even tougher?
Yeah, I think one thing that I heard Kelly say that I think is absolutely true is that more law schools are really taking seriously the holistic admissions piece. So I would say do not blow off your essays, don't blow off the other parts of your application. So, absolutely have a great LSAT score, hopefully have a great GPA, but there's so much more that we are looking for than just who you are as numbers on paper. So whether you're applying for one of the new kind of equity and justice scholarships at William & Mary, or you're applying to us where you must on your application explain why you are committed to social justice work, take those parts of your application very seriously. I think also your writing samples, and if you have references that are needed, we are also looking for people who can help build our community, right? We are very much a community. We like to call ourselves the Howard Law family, right? And that means we need to know whether you're committed to being a lifelong member of this community, of this family. And so that becomes an incredibly important part of your application.
Great, thank you. Mr. West, I want to head us in a little bit different direction. You made some really interesting comments before about the balance that a person can have in his or her career, and that you can be a big firm lawyer, but also do work focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So particularly for students thinking about applying to law school, what kinds of things should they keep in mind as they think about what law schools to apply to when these issues are important to them, but they may want to do any number of things with a law degree?
Yeah, so one of the things I think we've learned from this conversation is the sort of expectations in that space that some of the deans at a lot of the law schools might have. I mean, it's certainly an important thing to sort of educate yourselves, not just on the traditional things that we might typically look to when we're trying to make a decision about law schools, but the extent to which the members of both the current ecosystem for that school or the extended ecosystem, the alumni, for example, have an interest in that type of thing, and the extent to which diversity, inclusion, and equity are part of the DNA of the organization or the DNA of that particular law school. I would also point out that there are a lot more tools available to you to help you make that decision than the dark ages when I was preparing myself to go to law school. Seek those resources out. Kelly and LSAC are a very good, obvious resource. And I know, being a member of the Council for the Section of Legal Education and Admissions to the Bar, I have the occasion, whenever we have our meetings, to hear from Kelly and from other organizations that report to that body about the wealth of tools and access and information that's accessible. Make yourself available, or make all of those things available to you, and make an informed decision.
Great, good, thank you. Great advice. Professor Moran, you're not deaning right now, so I'll particularly give you this question. How should applicants think about law schools, sorting out what law schools to apply to in terms of their interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, at least when I was dean, the two things that motivated decisions about where to go to law school were the ranking and financial aid. And those were the drivers. And so then the question is, should those be the drivers or should you be looking at anything else? And I would say those are clearly important considerations for people because they relate to what kind of options you'll have when you get out. But once you have a cohort of schools that are within the range that you're interested in, then I think you really have to remember that although you may think you know exactly what you want to do when you go to law school, you may change your mind. I had a student who, when I was dean, she was an alum at that point, but when she was a student, she was absolutely certain of what she wanted to do. She went out and worked the first summer and thought, boy, this is exactly what I don't want to do. So you should really go to a school that has a broad enough sort of portfolio of offerings that if you have a transformational experience and you realize that what you thought you always wanted to do is actually the opposite of what you want to do, you'll still have plenty of room to achieve your goals. But I want to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that that is a value of the institution that permeates everything it does. So whatever your career goals turn out to be, diversity, equity, and inclusion should be a part of your preparation. And so I really think of that as really not a separate career choice, but simply an integral part of a good law school education.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to ask another question for our deans, and then I'll turn it back to Kelly. So what happens during the Q&A, we often have students with particularly non-traditional backgrounds asking about, how law schools will accept them. And Kelly and I always tell students, law schools do want to diversify their student body, but several of the Q&A came from students who are not US citizens, who are resident aliens or want to come to law school. Any advice to give to non-US citizens who are looking for a JD in the fall of 2021? Dean Spencer, you want to start?
Absolutely. Well, our doors are wide open. I mean, we are absolutely interested, and I'm very heartened to hear you mention that there are a number of international students on the line who are interested in law school, because I was just reading in the Chronicle of Higher Education today an article about the decline in international students that was predated COVID, but has been accelerated and exacerbated by the COVID crisis. And so we are unfortunately, looking out in the future and seeing or concerned about the prospect of fewer international students. And so to the extent that there are international students that are still interested and available to attend a law school in the United States, there's no question that there is a place for you. Absolutely. So we welcome that. And that's both in the JD and our LLM program. I know a number of schools have LLM programs as well, and we have an international LLM program that is absolutely looking for students from abroad. So please don't be discouraged in that respect. And you mentioned non-traditional students, and I remember Kelly talked earlier about a student who was older. And I just want to confirm, we have a student in our first year class who graduated from college in 1983. And we have the full spectrum of all ages that you can imagine. And we have people who have prior military service and who are currently serving in the military. And that's another important thing that we are welcoming of. So it doesn't matter what your background is, what age, there's a place for you, absolutely. So please don't be discouraged and reach out to any of these schools to apply.
Thank you. I remember when I was a law student, in our study group, we had a 40-year-old, and I thought he was really old. The rest of us were 22 and 23, and now 40 seems like a long time ago. Dean Halliwalker, I saw you nodding your head sometimes while Dean Spencer was talking. Any comments about non-US citizens applying to Howard?
we really welcome international students in our JD program and also in our LLM program. We have an LLM program that focuses particularly on human rights and civil rights work. And so we for a long time have really used that power of the African diaspora. So students from the Caribbean and from Africa who have been coming to Howard for the last 70 or 80 years to work specifically in our JD program and also in our LLM program. So we consider it one of our kind of strategic strengths is really having international students with us in the JD and our LLM program.
Great. Thank you. Kelly, let me flip it back to you. You have some questions.
Thank you so much, Ken. And what a great discussion. There's so much to do, but also so many reasons to be hopeful that as we keep collaborating and staying focused on the right issues, we can all advance the equity that we seek. I think what I want to do in our time left, we have under 10 minutes, is each of the panelists has just so much to share that I really want to ask each person more of an open-ended question and just ask you for any kind of summative or closing comments that you might have that pick up on things we've either already hit or things that we haven't had a chance to talk about today. And I think I'll just go in the order we first introduced you and ask you each to make a closing comment. So Dean Holly Walker, I think that means we start with you and go right around.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and to Ken for having us today. I'm just excited to see so many people at the webinar and many students who are thinking about applying to law school. I really encourage you to apply. I want to say that there is a law school for everyone, right? So, I think there are very few applicants who apply and don't get into a single law school, right? So please make sure that you are really doing your research on all of the law schools that are possibly available to you, your interest, where you are in your life in terms of whether you consider yourself a traditional or non-traditional student. There is room for you in legal education, and we want to make sure that you feel like that there are lots of great fits in terms of part-time, full-time programs, programs that allow you to do more online or remote instruction even outside of the pandemic. I think the other thing is that we're at a critical time in terms of our country's pursuit of racial justice. We are almost 100 years from the anniversary when Charles Hamilton Houston came to Howard's Law School as its vice dean and really began a program that led eventually to Brown versus Board of Education and having a belief that his students and his faculty and that the alumni of Howard's Law School could change the face of the Constitution. And it took them many years from 1929 until the Brown decision and after that to really make that a reality. But that's why I love this job and I love being a law school educator, is because I truly believe that lawyers are a critical part of making our society a more just and more equal place. And I hope that that will inspire you as you think about coming to law school.
Thank you so much. I'm ready to go again. That's awesome. Dean Spencer, let me ask you for some closing comments.
Well, what I want to say is that having the passion that I know many of you have to affect social change and improve along the lines of equity and racial justice is important. But I think it often goes unsaid, and so I want to say it here, is that my advice is that you really focus on being highly skilled and competent and focused on pursuing excellence, because those things are really the foundation for being able to achieve meaningful impact. You can't just talk about and think about these things, but you really need to be outstanding and excellent at what you do. And Dean Holly Walker took the words out of my mouth when she referenced Charles Hamilton Houston, who was one of my role models. And when I look at him, who was a great dean of Howard, and I have another role model, James Nabert, who was a dean at Howard as well. What stands out for me is the excellence that they exuded and that they instilled in the people that they trained. You wouldn't have been able to have the victories of Brown and many other litigation victories in the civil rights era if you didn't have highly skilled, intelligent, competent attorneys to pursue these things. So it's not just about having the passion, but you really have to have the ability. And that takes hard work. So never forget that. It takes a lot of hard work and dedication. So always keep your eye on excellent and being excellence. And then when you wed that with the passion that you have, that's when you know you're going to really be able to make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dean Spencer. Dean Moran, would love to hear from you.
Okay, well, thank you first of all for this wonderful conversation. And I wanted to just highlight three things that I think are sometimes forgotten. The first one is that when you get to law school, you can get caught up in conventional pathways and peer pressure and who's getting what. And if you can step back from that and remember to listen to your inner voice and be self-directed in your journey through law school and be sure you're getting what you want and not what everybody else thinks you should want, you will be much happier in the long run. The second thing is, as I mentioned before, build your networks of support. And the personal ones are really important, your friends and your family, but also those professional networks are critical. And those are the ones that traditionally underrepresented groups often don't access. So force yourself to make those connections and you'll be very glad you did. The third one is play the long game. A short-term victory that feels sweet, even if it's petty, will not serve you well if it hurts you in the long run. And I'm just going to give you one quick story because we had an alumna very highly placed in an entertainment studio. When she wanted to get into entertainment law, she called all these people and said, could we have lunch so I could find out how you got where you are? And she said she learned a lot about character from those calls because some people were warm and informative, and some of them basically were very dismissive, and one of them wouldn't even take a lunch with her. Well, when she had her studio position, lo and behold, this person who had been so dismissive contacted her because he needed something. And it had been so unimportant to him at the time when she reached out that he had forgot about the fact that he'd basically blown her off, but she didn't forget. And that, of course, might lead you to understand how that conversation went. So don't forget that people who may seem unimportant at the time could be important to you later. Treat everyone with the dignity, respect, and care that you would want.
That is such a good story and such an important reminder to always see each person with their own humanity and to treat them accordingly. Mr. West, I want to thank you for being with us and your great service with the ABA and all you do in your law firm. I would love to hear some closing remarks from you.
Yeah, I will make this brief. When I was listening to Dean Spencer talk about the value of just being excellent and working very hard, I thought about John Carlos and Tommie Smith. They were two people who were part of an iconic picture from the 1968 Olympics when they protested racial injustice in the United States from the medal stand. And John Carlos was interviewed about that, and someone was asking him what is it that he thought about during the race, whether it was how he was going to protest, what form the protest was going to take. And he said, I was thinking about winning the race. He said, because if I didn't win the race, I wouldn't have made it to the medal stand, and all would have been for naught. All of the planning for the protests and all of that would have been for naught. So he was thinking about the hard work and the preparation and the effort that would have gone into winning the race and getting to the point where he could be on that platform. And I think the point you made, Dean Spencer, is a very, very good one about just really working hard and being good at what you do so that you could have that platform. The other point I'll make, and it's a connected one, I think, is this. In the corridors of power now, I think the voices of young people are being heard. I think the accountability buffer that used to exist between sort of like the grassroots ecosystem and the people at the top of the food chain, that accountability buffer is shrinking and eroding. And what that means is that young people really do have the ability to effectuate change and that their voices are being heard. So make sure that you use your voices and use them in the most constructive way possible.
That's encouraging and also such good advice in the combination to both, learn the capacity to make a difference, the ability to make a difference through that hard work and excellence, and then be ready when it's time so that your voice can be heard and you can make a difference. Ken, I have just a couple closing comments, but I want to see if you have any closing comment before I do that. And thank you for, as always, for co-hosting with me.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. We've never had a better program. Panelists, you've been terrific today. You're all so busy. Thank you for your time and your insights today.
And I want to thank each of you too. I've learned a lot today, and it's just wonderful to have you with us. And I thank you not only for being here, but for the ways in each of your worlds you are constantly that ripple in the water and making those differences. So great thanks to our panelists. And I want to thank the audience for tuning in today. I hope we've been able to answer some of your questions. My team at LSAC will get back to you if we haven't yet answered. And anytime you need something, you don't know where else to reach out, please reach out to me, lsac.org. You can always email me directly too, and we're there to help and to open arms widely and help you through this process. I'll also just let you know that LSAC will be hosting a candidate webinar that I hope will address more of your questions on December 10th. And that will feature some new judges and justices in our nation who will talk about their pathway in law, including the first Black woman to be on the Washington State Supreme Court, Justice Helen Whitener, who I'm proud to say was one of my students back when I was a professor. So please know that we want your voice in law. You can see the kind of people here today that you'll have a chance to work with. Wonderful leaders who are there to help you make the difference you want to make. So thank you, and keep your passion for justice.